This week is a week in which perhaps potentially this is maybe the first week of the Anthropocene age, because up until now, we've not really been in control of nature. And perhaps it's the news about the IPCC report and climate change that is actually going to make us sit up and take notice and start to take control of nature in a way that is sympathetic with it. So I'm going to be talking about the essential skills around biosphere literacy, which might help us take that step. And rewilding will feature because rewilding is one manifestation of the subject of biosphere literacy. So, I mean, I don't know how you are feeling about the IPCC report. My feelings are very similar to the feelings I've had for the last 20 years with my concerns about climate change, just intensified, and they just keep intensifying all the time, the more that we hear about it. It's a thread that's going to run through my brief talk is thinking about the future and time and how we deal with this conundrum that we've never been in a time where educating for the future, for future skills, it's the most important thing that we have to do is to educate for the future. But because of the news about the short time ahead of us to take action and the potential ending of normal life on this planet, we're in this conundrum where we just really can't see what the future will bring. So I think that the essential skills around biosphere literacy are partly to do with how we think about an uncertain future. So I believe that biosphere literacy, or for want of a better word, you might suggest better terms to me, because I've asked a few people, what do you think of this? And they don't really understand it, so please suggest better words. But I think it's the root of all learning, and I think it's immeasurably more important than the literal literacy that people like Michael Gove talk about as being the root of learning. I'm not just going to talk about schools, I'm not just talking about formal education, I'm talking about the development of a skill set that we all need to embrace, and that all organisations, such as cultural organisations, science institutes, they're all responsible for developing biosphere literacy. So what is it as a subject? It's, well, literacy is about decoding, interpreting, and creating meaning from texts. Biosphere literacy, perhaps, is being able to map life in its place, to make meaning from it, and to nurture and create, to generate more life. So perhaps it's more than just literacy, but a much more creative area of skills. And rewilding, as I said before, is a manifestation of biosphere literacy. It's a practical example. I believe in learning through praxis, and rewilding is perhaps one area of praxis that we need to engage in, one of several regenerative tasks ahead of us. So biosphere literacy as a subject would involve greater understanding of the context of the biosphere. And I think basic education doesn't really address this. I'd be interested to know who in their education was introduced to the idea of the biosphere. Does it? Okay, not too many hands, okay. And especially maybe not in school, at school level. And so it's not actually just the biosphere. This diagram shows the range of spheres that make up our Earth operating system. And those spheres are the biosphere, the hydrosphere, the geosphere, the cryosphere, and they all interact. And I think that what we have is a kind of aphasia regarding Earth systems, and our culture and our education haven't helped us map and conceive the interrelations between all of these spheres. And these basic concepts should also include learning about the planetary boundaries. Granted, it is a fairly new concept, but I think it's fundamentally important for us to learn about the planetary boundaries and how the impacts on the environment are also impacts on humanity. So if that was biosphere literacy as a subject, as an ethos, I think its key shift, I should explain what this slide is. This is an ant death spiral. And I'll explain what this means. So I think a key shift is that we need to recognize that nature is self and that nature is constituted as a mesh that we are part of. You've probably heard that. That's probably a very familiar concept, but it's really a very, very alien concept in the structures of our cultural understanding. So I argue that we're not just within nature, we are it. So when we talk about being disconnected from nature, we're not disconnected from it. We are nature, but gone awry. So this ant death spiral is an interesting phenomenon. It happens when ants lose the pheromone trail and they start circling together and they just can't stop until death. And so, you know, it may be an interesting metaphor that we're part of a community caught in a death spiral, depleting and destroying our own self-world and therefore ourselves. So that's the kind of ethical base or the philosophical base of biosphere consciousness. I just want to now run through some steps or the dimensions of it to help us embed it into society. So the first step, I think, is to diagnose what's wrong with us, to know what's wrong with us. And I think that we're in a psychosis. We are animals, but we're most of us living in captivity. And we're forced to play within social structures and physical structures that go against our nature by prioritizing competition and conflict. So I don't know if you've seen the film Blackfish. This image is from the film Blackfish, quite recent film, which is about how killer whales have grown psychotic and depressed because of their captivity and the service they're having to perform. So I think perhaps humans are all in the same predicament. Next, we have to know what's wrong with our actions. We have to reframe our moral and our legal codes. And I think fundamentally, we have to put ecocide at the root of our legal framework, and to also recognize that ecocide is entirely wrapped up in genocide, or rather, that ecocide is a bigger category than genocide. I don't mean it's worse, I mean it's a bigger category. And that we could have a whole debate about that, I'm sure. The next thing that we have to do is to know precisely how it's all gone wrong. So this is a kind of more content-rich area of study. We have to join the dots between our consumption of industrial goods, our extraction of them from the earth, their impact on our health and their footprint on the planet. I'm not going to go into that in any detail, but it's one perhaps that is being tackled by the media more than any other area, perhaps, but still maybe not effectively enough. We also have to know how to think about the future, and that's why we're all here. You're all interested in that. So we have to learn how to continually look to the future and do constructive scenario planning. But in doing that, we have to really understand how to deal with the undealable with black swans, the critical uncertainties that are facing us, that are mainly related to climate change, but also the interconnected other breaching of planetary boundaries. As well as trying to think about these unaccountable uncertainties, we also have to take a long view and think about how there might be thriving despite these events. The next thing is to know how to create new cultures. Does anyone recognize this man? Yeah, Joseph Beuys. So Beuys devised a new form of art practice called social sculpture. And he was suggesting that the shift we need is to go beyond a notion of art as a commodity towards art as change-making. And I agree with this. I would want to extend it to what I would call planetary sculpture. I think artists are perhaps these days not just potentially social sculptors, but planetary sculptors. I'm very interested in my own work as a cultural consultant in the role of cultural organisations and artists to become potential planetary sculptors. There's quite a lot of work still to do in that area. The next thing that we need to do is to know how to learn. And this is an image of a lovely school in Bali called the Green School, which is very, very rooted in nature and where it's very democratic and children are very much in charge of their learning. So that for me is a model of education. But in general, I'm not just talking about schools. I think we have to rethink institutions. And Mark Stevenson, who's my business partner, is going to be leading this afternoon's discussions in here about the reform of institutions. But really, all organisations are learning organisations. They develop people. And the reform that's needed is to stop serving a short-term, unsustainable economy to structures that enable people to develop well-being, autonomous thought, and what I'm interested in called positive deviance, which is really about deviating from the norm in a positive way. So I suggest that good learning practice is emotional and contextual and playful. Okay, the next thing we have to do is to know how to communicate the vision, and a big task is to re-language media. I think media have a big role to play. I think Mark Woolpott on the radio was talking about, after the IPCC report, the key challenge really is communication. And I'd really love it if we could see many more ecological ways of knowing and greener visions of how to live infiltrating in the media. The next thing that we need to do, the slide is just kind of abstract really in relation to this, is to know how to account. So I do think that we have to take an instrumental approach to nature. I am a green person, but I think that we live in a very instrumentalist world, and we have to value nature for its ecosystem services, but with a difference from normal thinking, that we need to multiply the value to human beings by the potential value of ecosystems to millions of other species. So it's a concept I need to kind of work out, how would that actually work in practice? Maybe you know that other people are working on that. The next thing that we need to do is, and this is related to rewilding, that we have to know what nature looks like when it's thriving. We're quite used to looking at landscapes that are fairly green and thinking, aha, there's nature, I want to go out into it, it's green and lovely. But quite often those landscapes are depleted, or they're just not thriving because they're not native enough. They're not suited to the place. The species are not suited to the place. And the person in this picture is Alan Watson Featherstone, who is the founder of Trees for Life. I just had the great privilege of spending a week with him a couple of weeks ago. And his aim is to restore the Caledonian forest. It's a fairly crazy scheme, but one that he's been working on since the 1970s and has made a lot of progress. And he is the inspiration, I think, for George Monbiot's book, Feral, which he was going to talk about today. I'm not surprised that he would be inspiring. He's not a scientist. I think he's really interesting. I talked about the importance of praxis-based learning. He didn't really study science, but he did study science through the practical experience of rewilding native forest over the last 40 or so years. So he over this week, he downloaded his knowledge to us, extraordinary knowledge about how ecosystems, how nature thrives when you restore the trophic cascades of nature. And we went into the, we went close to nature and looked at the kind of micro level of interacting systems and the macro level of regeneration. So if you don't know of his work, read his blog, he's amazing. But the thing that really struck me was this question about hope and time, because the reason why it, I think, shifted George Monbiot's thinking was that it gave him hope, because Alan is planting native trees that will mature in 100 or 200 years. And you know, we're hearing about the effects of climate change devastating our environments and our civilizations within 100 years. So there's a real kind of conundrum there about how we, the things that we need to do to restore the planet are going to really be taking effect in 100, 200 years beyond our lifetimes. But the things that are happening to destroy environments are working less in a shorter time scale. So in a way, that kind of leads me to the final point, really, which is about what we need to do to cope with that conundrum, that difficulty of seeing the future. All we can do, I think, is to do what we can do well, and to do it in our place with a global mindset. And this is just an example of what I do, or what we do in my neighbourhood. That's an organisation called Grow Wild, which helps people learn how to grow plants, to forage for plants. You know, it's a very familiar scheme. I'm not pretending it's very innovative, but it is a network of people that spread practical optimism, and I think it stitches communities between communities as places where you a dormitory community where you come and sleep, and then the places that you go to work. It makes our home a place of work and a place of connection. So I just really want to finish up with this idea that rewilding is not just something that happens in the Caledonian forest. It is potentially something that happens in our backyards and our rooftops, and also perhaps in our hearts, because Alan Watson Featherstone talks about the act of rewilding as not just being to do with our green fingers or green thumbs, which is a more Scottish phrase, but the greenness in our hearts. So that's my conclusion, really, that we need to become more green-hearted. Thank you.